People always sound sincere when they make promises. That's what makes them dangerous. Not because they intend to lie, but because most promises are made inside emotions that won't exist forever. Someone looks into your eyes and says they'll always be there. They believe it. At least in that moment. The attention feels real. The connection feels permanent. The certainty feels unbreakable. And that's exactly why people trust it. Because it doesn't sound like deception. It sounds like conviction. But time has a strange habit of exposing the difference between what people feel and what people become. Most people aren't prepared for that realization. Because they assume loyalty disappears dramatically. They expect betrayal, conflict, arguments, distance. They expect to see the ending coming. Instead, they discover something much quieter. Something much more difficult to accept. People often forget long before they leave. And that usually begins so subtly that you barely notice it. At first, nothing looks different. The messages still arrive. The conversations still happen. The routines remain intact. But something invisible starts changing beneath the surface. The curiosity becomes weaker. The attention becomes less automatic. The emotional investment becomes less instinctive. And eventually you find yourself noticing things you never thought you'd notice. They stop asking questions they used to ask naturally. The details they once remembered suddenly disappear. Stories you've already told become stories they no longer remember. You repeat things that once felt unforgettable. And that's when an uncomfortable thought quietly enters your mind. Maybe the promise still exists. But the emotional intensity that created it doesn't. Most people never realize how much memory is connected to emotional significance. People remember what emotionally affects them. They remember what emotionally moves them. They remember what emotionally matters. When that significance changes, attention changes with it. And attention is often the first thing to leave. Not love. Not commitment. Attention. The thing people rarely talk about. The thing people rarely notice until it's gone. Because attention feels invisible when you're receiving it. You only become aware of it when it starts disappearing. When you notice you're speaking and they're scrolling. When you realize your stories receive shorter reactions. When your excitement feels larger than their interest. When your presence no longer changes the atmosphere. That's when the emotional imbalance begins. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. There is a specific kind of loneliness that exists inside relationships. A loneliness that feels worse than being alone. Because you're standing beside someone who once noticed everything. Someone who once remembered small details you forgot yourself. Someone who once treated your presence like an event. And now you're watching them slowly adapt to you. Slowly become accustomed to you. Slowly stop seeing what they once couldn't stop seeing. Familiarity rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. Like dust gathering on something valuable. Until one day you realize they no longer look at you the same way. Not because they hate you. Not because they're cruel. Because observation slowly faded into assumption. They assume you'll be there. Assume you'll understand. Assume you'll wait. Assume you'll stay. And people often stop actively valuing what feels guaranteed. That's the part people struggle admitting out loud. People stop chasing what feels guaranteed. The frightening thing is what happens next. You start noticing it. You start measuring things. How long they take to respond. How often they initiate. How much enthusiasm exists in their voice. How quickly conversations end. How often you're the one keeping emotional energy alive. You begin collecting evidence. Tiny pieces of emotional evidence. Not because you're insecure. Because something inside you already senses the shift. Long before your mind accepts it. Long before anyone says anything. You feel it. The delayed response. The distracted eye contact. The missing curiosity. The disappearing effort. And suddenly you're paying attention to everything. Waiting for reassurance. Looking for signs. Searching for proof that you still matter the same way. But the search itself changes you. That's what nobody talks about. The search changes you. You become more careful. More observant. More anxious. More dependent on reactions. You stop speaking naturally. You start speaking strategically. You stop expressing yourself freely. You begin calculating emotional outcomes. Will this interest them? Will they respond? Will they care? Will they notice? And little by little, your emotional confidence begins attaching itself to their reactions. That's when people slowly stop recognizing themselves. Because attachment has a strange ability to make people betray their own standards. You tolerate things you once questioned. Accept things you once challenged. Ignore things you once considered unacceptable. Not because your values changed. Because your fear changed. The fear of losing connection becomes larger than the discomfort of losing yourself. And that transformation happens so gradually that most people don't see it happening. One day you're expressing your needs. Months later you're apologizing for having them. One day you're expecting consistency. Months later you're grateful for scraps of attention. One day affection feels normal. Months later basic effort feels like a reward. The frightening part is how normal this begins to feel. How quickly people adapt to emotional deprivation. How quickly they lower expectations. How quickly occasional attention starts feeling valuable. Because uncertainty creates hunger. And hunger changes perception. Suddenly you're excited by things that once would have felt ordinary. A quick message. A compliment. A small sign of interest. A few extra minutes of attention. The emotional standard keeps moving lower. And most people don't notice until much later. Attention changes before love admits it. The problem is that people often mistake promises for permanence. They assume words are stronger than emotional reality. But emotional reality is what determines behavior. Not promises. Not intentions. Behavior. Someone can genuinely mean every promise they make. And still become a completely different person later. Because people rarely anticipate how much they will change. How much life will change. How much attention will change. How much emotional urgency will change. The person making the promise and the person forgetting it are often the same person. Separated only by time. And that's what makes it painful. There is no villain. No dramatic betrayal. No obvious deception. Just gradual emotional erosion. The slow disappearance of significance. The slow fading of emotional intensity. The slow transformation of certainty into familiarity. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changes completely. The humiliation often appears in unexpected moments. You see them laughing harder with someone else. You hear enthusiasm in their voice that used to belong to conversations with you. You watch them become curious about people they barely know. Questions they no longer ask you. Attention they no longer offer you. Energy they no longer bring home. And suddenly you're forced to confront a painful possibility. Maybe they didn't lose the ability to care. Maybe they simply stopped investing that care here. That realization can feel devastating. Because it attacks something deeper than rejection. It attacks identity. You begin questioning your value. Your attractiveness. your importance, your emotional impact. You wonder whether you've changed, whether you've become boring, whether you've become ordinary, whether you've become forgettable. And that fear follows people into quiet moments, late at night, staring at old conversations, reading messages from months ago, looking for evidence that things were once different, because they were. And that's what hurts. You can see the contrast, the enthusiasm, the effort, the curiosity, the attention. It existed, which makes its absence impossible to ignore. People notice absence faster than presence. And eventually you realize something even darker. Sometimes you're not missing the person. You're missing how intensely they used to notice you. You're missing the emotional significance, the feeling of being seen, the feeling of affecting someone emotionally, the feeling of mattering without effort. Because there is a profound difference between being loved and being noticed. People often assume they're the same thing. They aren't. Someone can care about you and still stop observing you, still stop pursuing you, still stop becoming emotionally curious about you. And that's where many relationships begin emotionally dying long before anyone leaves. The conversations remain. The routines remain. The structure remains. But the emotional electricity quietly disappears. No announcement. No warning. No dramatic ending. Just silence growing where fascination once lived. Comfort slowly removes urgency. That truth feels uncomfortable because everyone wants permanence. Everyone wants certainty. But human attention rarely stays frozen. It moves, shifts, changes, drifts. And sometimes people discover that the promise they trusted most was built on emotions that no longer exist. Not because those emotions were fake, because they were temporary. Like seasons people mistook for climates. And perhaps that's the most unsettling realization of all. Most people aren't haunted by broken promises. They're haunted by remembering how convincing they sounded. How believable they felt. How certain they seemed. Because certainty is seductive. Certainty feels safe. Certainty feels permanent. Until reality quietly proves otherwise. And by the time people recognize what's happening, they're often already standing in emotional ruins trying to remember exactly when everything changed. The terrifying answer is usually the same. Nothing changed overnight. The forgetting happened slowly. One unnoticed moment at a time. One distracted conversation at a time. One missing question at a time. One forgotten detail at a time. Until eventually the promise remained. But the attention that gave it life was gone. And that's the part people rarely recover from. Not the broken words. The realization that they became ordinary to someone who once made them feel unforgettable. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.